There was no ban, no arrest, no warning letter. People didn't stop speaking because they were forced. They stopped because it felt safer. This is the story of how silence became the smartest choice. And the people who made that choice believed they were doing the right thing. And it didn't happen all at once. It happened step by step. He was not an activist. Not controversial. Not loud. He never marched in the streets or raised his voice in meetings. He didn't write opinion columns or argue online. He didn't wear slogans or challenge authority head-on. He was a high school teacher in a quiet American town where nothing ever seemed to change. Every morning, he arrived before the bell rang. Same parking spot. Same hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old books. Same classroom with peeling maps on the wall and a clock that always ran 1 minute slow. On his desk sat the same chipped coffee mug he'd used for years. No slogans on it. No messages. Just a crack along the side from when a student once knocked it over by accident. He taught history, not as a weapon. Not as a warning shouted at the present, but as a story, layered, human, unfinished. Facts, dates, context. He believed history wasn't about choosing sides. It was about understanding how people got there. Why fear made reasonable people do unreasonable things. Why silence often followed moments of crisis. Why freedoms were rarely taken in a single blow, but softened first, then narrowed, then redefined. He didn't tell students what to think. He asked them why. Why laws were passed during emergencies. Why some voices were amplified while others faded. Why entire generations later said, "We didn't see it happening." Sometimes, a student would raise a hand and ask a question that made the room go quiet. Why didn't more people speak up? How did this become normal? Could it happen again? He never answered too quickly. He let the silence sit. Because silence, he believed, was where thinking began. Nothing he said felt radical. Nothing he assigned was extreme. The textbooks were approved. The curriculum was standard. But the questions lingered longer than the bell. Parents liked him. Colleagues respected him. Administrators barely noticed him. That was the point. He wasn't trying to disrupt. He was trying to understand. And for a long time, that was enough. For years, questions were allowed. It happened during a normal class. The room was the color of winter gray walls, gray desks, gray light filtering through blinds that never fully opened. Outside, the schoolyard held the faint echo of laughter from another hour, another hallway, another world. Inside, everything moved the way it always did. The slow scratch of pencils, the soft hum of the heater fighting a losing battle, the teacher's voice drifting like a metronome, steady, practiced, safe. Mr. Halden stood at the front with a piece of chalk between his fingers, as if it were a small white anchor. He had taught U.S. history long enough to know when students were truly listening and when they were only present in body. Today felt ordinary. Ordinary was a blessing. Ordinary meant no parent calls, no meetings, no headlines, no sudden shifts in the air. He was halfway through a lesson on the early 20th century migration. Factory towns, the way people learned to live shoulder to shoulder, and pretend it didn't change them when he noticed a hand rise in the third row. Not the dramatic kind of hand that shoots up like a flare. Not the kind that comes with a smirk or a dare. This hand lifted slowly, like someone testing the temperature of the room. It belonged to a girl he'd only recently learned to pronounce correctly on the first try. Maya Whitfield. She was small and quiet in a way that made adults underestimate the weight of her thoughts. The type of student who took notes in neat lines, who kept her backpack zipped, who didn't ask to go to the bathroom just to escape. He remembered her essays were careful, too careful sometimes, like she was afraid her words might bruise something if she pressed too hard. He nodded to her. Maya didn't stand, didn't perform. She didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching, which somehow made it feel more serious. She just asked, softly, as if she were asking for the date, "Why do people stop speaking when they're afraid?" The question landed without a sound, like snow. And yet the entire room seemed to hear it in the same instant. Even the heater clicked quieter. A pencil stopped mid-scratch. Somewhere in the back, a chair leg shifted and then froze. Mr. Halden felt it, an invisible hand closing around the ordinary he'd been holding. He watched Maya's face, not angry, not accusing, curious, almost sad, like someone who had already seen the answer, but still needed someone to say it out loud. He paused. In the pause, his mind did what minds do when they sense danger. It searched for the safest doorway out. He could have joked, could have deflected, could have turned it into an assignment and postponed the weight of it until later. But there was something in Maya's eyes that asked for honesty without drama, as if drama would insult the question. So he answered carefully, calmly, historically. He walked to the board and wrote one word in clean block letters. Fear, then another, conformity, then a third, survival. People stop speaking, he began, keeping his tone even, because speech is a risk. Not always a big risk. Sometimes it's small, like being laughed at or being left out. But our brains treat it like a threat. A few students looked up from their phones. That alone told him the question had teeth. He continued, choosing examples the way a man carries glass slowly, with both hands. History is full of moments where silence spread faster than truth, he said. Not because people didn't know something was wrong, but because they didn't know what it would cost them to say it. He talked about factory towns where workers swallowed complaints because the paycheck fed younger siblings. He talked about neighbors during eras of suspicion, when one wrong sentence could turn into a knock on the door. He spoke of the way groups learn to punish difference, not with whips or chains, but with looks, whispers, and the quiet threat of being alone. No one has to order you to be silent, he said. If you've seen what happens to someone else who speaks. His voice stayed steady, but his palms had gone faintly damp. He didn't know why. He hadn't said anything radical. He hadn't said anything modern. He hadn't said any names. But the room felt like it was holding its breath. Maya didn't interrupt. She listened the way someone listens at a bedside. Her hands were folded on the desk. Her chin dipped slightly, as if she were saving each sentence. Mr. Halden offered one more layer, softer than the rest. Sometimes people stop speaking because they begin to doubt themselves. Fear doesn't just threaten your safety. It threatens your certainty. It makes you ask, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's safer to let it pass. A silence followed, not the heavy, hostile kind, but the kind that forms after a truth has been placed on the table and everyone is suddenly aware of its shape. Then, from somewhere near the windows, the bell rang, sharp, metallic, final. The spell broke the way spells always do, suddenly and without ceremony. Chairs scraped, bags zipped. Voices returned, too loud at first, as if everyone needed to prove they were still allowed to make noise. Students poured into the hallway like a river reclaiming its channel. Maya stood with the rest, tucking her notebook away with the same careful movements. Before she left, she looked up at Mr. Halden, not with gratitude, not with defiance, with something harder to name, a kind of quiet relief. Then she was gone. Mr. Halden erased the board, the chalk dust rising like pale smoke. He glanced at the clock, already thinking about the next class, the next lesson, the next set of papers waiting in a stack on his desk. The hallway roared the way hallways always do, teenage life rushing forward. Unconcerned with the weight of a single question, he straightened the papers on the podium, picked up a marker, took a sip of lukewarm coffee. He thought nothing of it. That evening, his inbox had a new message. He noticed it only after the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, the refrigerator humming, the tick of the wall clock marking seconds he no longer measured. His jacket lay over the back of a chair. His coffee mug sat untouched beside a stack of essays he hadn't yet graded. The subject line was gentle, concern about today's class. Apparent, polite, measured, carefully written, as if each sentence had been weighed before being allowed to exist. My child felt uncomfortable today, it began. No anger, no threats. Just concern dressed in courtesy. He read it twice, then a third time, searching for the sharp edge that never appeared. The parent mentioned values, emotional safety, the importance of keeping classrooms neutral. They thanked him for his dedication before signing off with a warm, professional name. He exhaled. Uncomfortable was not an accusation. Uncomfortable was human. He closed the laptop halfway, stood, poured himself a glass of water. By the time he sat back down, another notification blinked softly at the corner of the screen. Another email. Then another. Different senders. Different phrasing. The same careful distance. Maybe certain topics aren't appropriate at this age. Perhaps it's better to stick closely to the curriculum. We just want our kids to feel safe. No one claimed he'd done something wrong. No one said he'd crossed a line. They didn't need to. He began to notice the pattern, not in what they said, but in what they avoided. No one referenced the actual question. No one quoted the words spoken in class. It was as if naming them might give them weight. Discomfort, he realized, was safer when left undefined. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, where the paint had cracked in a thin, wandering line he'd meant to fix for years. His mind replayed the classroom in fragments. A raised hand, a pause, the sound of the bell. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just a question. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from a colleague. Everything okay today? Admin forwarded a few emails. Probably nothing. Probably nothing. He typed a response, erased it, typed again. Settled on something neutral. All good. Just a discussion. He told himself he was overthinking. Parents worry. That's their job. Schools absorb that worry, filter it, move on. This was not new. This was not dangerous. Still, he didn't open the essays. Instead, he scrolled. One more email had arrived while he wasn't looking. This one was shorter. I'm sure you didn't mean any harm. But some conversations can feel heavy right now. Heavy. He tasted the word. It sat on the tongue like something solid. Like responsibility. Like blame without accusation. He closed his inbox. In the quiet that followed, he understood something he had never been taught in training sessions or faculty meetings. That no one needed to forbid a thing for it to disappear. They only needed to make it costly to continue. No one told him to stop asking questions. No one warned him. They simply made the air around them thinner. Discomfort didn't shout. It didn't argue. It didn't even demand. It gathered quietly, politely, until it filled the room. And discomfort, he learned, was enough. The principal invited him in, not urgently, not formally. Just a calendar request slipped between faculty meetings and lunch duty. Whenever you have a moment. The office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Certificates lined the walls, decades of calm leadership framed in glass. A small flag stood in the corner. The blinds were half open, letting in a soft, careful light. The principal smiled when he entered. A practiced smile. Friendly. The kind meant to put people at ease before anything uncomfortable had a chance to exist. Have a seat, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her voice was warm, almost grateful, as if he were doing her a favor just by showing up. No threats, no accusations. She folded her hands, then unfolded them. Chose her words with the same care he once chose his lesson plans. I want to start by saying, she began, you didn't do anything wrong. He nodded automatically. Relief rose in him, small, cautious, but real. But, she continued gently, we have to be careful. Careful was a word he trusted. Careful meant professionalism. It meant balance. It meant survival in systems that preferred smooth edges. Times are sensitive, she said. He noticed how she didn't specify which times. Sensitive to what? Sensitive for whom? The word hovered between them, vague enough to be useful. She leaned back slightly, as if creating space where no conflict needed to sit. Some parents reached out, she said. Not complaints, just concerns. Concerns. He waited. She allowed the silence to stretch, not to pressure him, but to invite agreement. Silence can be persuasive when it feels shared. "The word I keep hearing," she said, "is misunderstanding." She didn't say harm. She didn't say danger. She said misunderstanding. "Some discussions invite misunderstanding," she added, almost apologetically. "Especially right now. Right now." He thought of the classroom, of Maya's raised hand, of his answer measured, historical, restrained. He replayed it, searching for sharp edges. Found none. "I understand the intent," the principal said. "Your intent has never been in question." Intent, another safe word. "But perception matters," she continued. "And our role is to protect students, to make sure everyone feels safe." Safe, the word landed heavier than it looked. Safety was not something you argued against. Safety was not something you qualified. She slid a folder across the desk. It remained closed. "No formal action," she said quickly, noticing his eyes. "Nothing like that, just guidance. Guidance. A suggestion shaped like a boundary." "Maybe," she said softly, "we keep discussions closer to the curriculum. Facts, dates, less interpretation." He nodded. He didn't speak because there was nothing to disagree with on paper. Everything she said was reasonable, thoughtful, measured. "You're a valued member of this school," she added. "We just want to make sure nothing is taken the wrong way." Taken the wrong way. He heard the unspoken sentence beneath it, "by the wrong people." He nodded again. Because nodding was easier than asking which questions were still allowed. Easier than asking where the line was now. Easier than asking how something could be both permitted and discouraged at the same time. The meeting ended the way it began. A smile, a thank you, an assurance that everything was fine. As he stood to leave, the principal said one last thing kindly, almost regretfully. "It's just about being mindful, mindful." He walked back down the hallway, past bulletin boards and student artwork, past the same lockers he'd passed every day for years. Nothing looked different, but something had shifted. Not because he'd been told to stop. Not because he'd been warned. Because now he knew. He nodded, he understood. Or at least he thought he did. He didn't change overnight. There was no moment where he woke up and decided to become someone else. No vow made in the mirror. No sudden fear that sent him erasing his past. Change came the way fog does, thin at first, barely noticeable, until one day the landscape no longer looked the same. At first, he just avoided certain examples. He skipped a story he used to tell about a factory strike that ended badly, replaced it with a chart. Numbers felt safer than people. When a student raised a hand and asked why things unfolded the way they did, he answered, but shorter, cleaner, less room for interpretation. Then he avoided certain words. Words he had spoken for years without hesitation now hovered in his throat, heavy and uncertain. He swapped them for neutral phrases, rounded the edges, filed down anything that might catch. The lesson plans grew smoother and emptier. Then he avoided certain pauses. He learned that silence invited risk, that the space after a sentence could be filled by someone else's meaning. So he spoke more quickly, moved on before anyone could linger too long on a thought that hadn't been fully shaped. Students noticed, though none of them said anything. The room felt different, not worse, just quieter. Safer, perhaps, in the way shallow water feels safer than the open sea. He noticed something strange. Before answering questions, his mind began checking itself, not for accuracy, but for consequence. Is this worth it? Could this be misread? Would this be quoted out of context? The questions stacked inside him like invisible flashcards, flipping faster than he could control. He still knew the material, still cared, still believed in the power of understanding. But belief now came with a calculation. He watched his students more closely than before, not to guide them, but to measure them. To see who might repeat a sentence at home, who might misunderstand intention for implication, who might feel something they couldn't yet name. No one told him to think this way. No memo, no warning, no rule. The system had taught him gently, the way systems prefer to teach. by letting him observe what happened when others spoke too freely, by showing him the cost without ever issuing a bill. At night, grading essays, he found himself circling certain lines, not because they were wrong, but because they were. Bold. He hesitated before writing encouragement, chose safer feedback. Praise without momentum. He told himself he was protecting them. Protecting himself. Protecting the classroom. Still, something felt like it was thinning. One afternoon, a student asked a question and then immediately added, "Never mind." The words landed harder than any email had. He nodded and moved on. Later, alone in his room, he stared at the chalkboard after the bell rang. The surface was clean, unmarked, perfectly neutral. And for the first time in his career, he realized that nothing had to be erased for something to disappear. No one told him to think this way. He learned, quietly, the students changed too. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way ice forms quietly, almost politely over water that once moved freely. Questions became shorter. What year was it? Will this be on the test? Is this required? Questions that could be answered without risk, without opinion, without the need to sit with uncertainty. Hands were raised less often. At first, he told himself it was coincidence, fatigue, the time of year, teenagers being teenagers. But he had taught long enough to recognize when a room stopped leaning forward. The air felt different now, still, careful, like a conversation happening behind glass. Students who once argued gently now copied quietly. Essays that used to wander into why stayed safely inside what. They learned faster, perhaps, cleaner. But something had gone missing, and none of them had the language to name it. Neither did he. He adjusted his pacing, filled silences with facts, moved on when eyes dropped. He became efficient, professional, exactly what was expected. And yet, he began to notice how often students stopped themselves. A hand would rise halfway, pause, then lower. A sentence would begin, then dissolve into, "Never mind." He never corrected them. One afternoon, after the bell rang and the hallway swallowed the noise of the day, a student stayed behind. It was Ethan, not a troublemaker, not outspoken. The kind of student teachers described as thoughtful and then quietly worried about, because thoughtful students feel more than they show. Ethan stood by the desk, backpack slung over one shoulder, shifting his weight as if unsure whether he was allowed to exist in the space now that class was technically over. "Can I ask you something?" he said. The question itself felt heavier than it should have. "Of course," the teacher replied, too quickly. Ethan hesitated, then spoke softly as if the walls might overhear. "Why don't teachers answer real questions anymore?" The words landed without accusation, without anger, just confusion. The teacher opened his mouth. A dozen responses rushed forward, careful ones, honest ones, dangerous ones. He could explain systems. He could talk about boundaries. He could even tell a version of the truth that sounded harmless. But he saw something in Ethan's face that stopped him. Expectation. Not the kind that demands, the kind that hopes. He closed his mouth. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint buzz of the lights overhead. In that silence, he felt the weight of every email, every meeting, every unspoken rule pressing gently against his chest. He smiled. It was the same smile he had learned to use everywhere now, warm, reassuring, empty enough to pass unnoticed. "That's a complicated question," he said. "You'll understand more as you get older." He reached for his papers, straightened a stack that didn't need straightening. "Hey," he added lightly, "how's your college prep going?" The subject changed, easily, too easily. Ethan nodded, answered, slipped back into the safe conversation offered to him. Within seconds, the moment was gone, sealed away like something fragile that couldn't survive exposure. When Ethan left, the teacher sat alone at his desk. Relief washed over him first. Relief that he hadn't said the wrong thing. Relief that no one could quote him. Relief that the risk had passed. And then, shame. sharp and quiet. Because he knew what he had done. He hadn't lied. He had done something worse. He had taught a student that some questions do not deserve answers. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the empty desks. At the places where curiosity used to sit. At the silence he had helped cultivate. And he hated himself for feeling relieved. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No headlines. No emergency meetings. No whispered rumors in the hallway. Life at the school continued with a smoothness that felt almost engineered. Schedules ran on time. Lesson plans aligned perfectly with standards. Emails became shorter, clearer, easier to archive. The kind of efficiency administrators praised in meetings and newsletters. Parents were satisfied. They stopped writing concerned emails and started writing grateful ones. Thank you for keeping the classroom focused. We appreciate the stability. Our kids seem less stressed lately. Administrators relaxed. There were fewer check-ins, fewer reminders, fewer conversations that began with, "just to be clear." The principal smiled more easily now. Meetings ended earlier. Problems were resolved before they could grow teeth. The school felt calm, orderly, safe. Hallways flowed like clockwork. Classrooms hummed with quiet compliance. Students learned exactly what was expected and gave nothing more. There were fewer debates, fewer raised voices, fewer moments that lingered after the bell. On paper, everything had improved. Test scores inched upward. Disruptions declined. The system functioned beautifully. The teacher became very good at his job. He delivered content efficiently, covered material thoroughly. He anticipated questions before they were asked and structured lessons so they never arrived. He filled every pause, left no space for uncertainty to stretch its legs. Students took notes, memorized dates, repeated definitions. They were good students. And they were quieter than he remembered. He noticed it most during discussions, how quickly they ended, how no one stayed behind to argue a point, how no one lingered in the doorway anymore, turning half-formed thoughts over in their hands. The classroom no longer surprised him. There were no moments that followed him home. No questions that echoed while he washed dishes or lay awake in the dark. Teaching had become something he could finish and leave behind. At first he told himself this was maturity, professional growth, boundaries. But sometimes late in the afternoon, when the sun slanted across empty desks, he felt a hollowness he couldn't grade or file away. The walls were still covered with maps. The chalkboard still stood ready. The desk still faced forward. Everything necessary was present, except something unnamed. Curiosity no longer wandered here. It had learned there was nothing for it. The room did not push back, did not invite, did not ask. The school had achieved what it wanted. Nothing broke. Nothing burned. Nothing resisted. The machine ran smoothly. And the teacher understood then, not with fear, but with a quiet, aching clarity, that this was how things were meant to end. Not with force. Not with punishment, but with comfort, with relief. With the gentle removal of everything that made the place feel alive, orderly, safe, and strangely empty. One evening, the teacher sat alone at his kitchen table, the house dim except for the small lamp beside him. Outside, the neighborhood had settled into its familiar quiet porch lights glowing, televisions murmuring behind closed doors. The kind of peace that once reassured him. He opened an old folder he hadn't touched in years. Lesson notes, yellowed pages, handwritten margins. Questions circled, underlined, rewritten again and again, not because they were dangerous, but because they mattered. Why did ordinary people accept this? At what point does obedience feel safer than truth? Who benefits when everyone stays quiet? He felt a tightening in his chest. These weren't radical questions. They weren't calls to action. They were invitations to think, to doubt, to notice the human cost hidden beneath dates and policies. He turned the pages slowly, topics he used to explore without hesitation. Discussions that once stretched past the bell because no one wanted to leave. Moments when a student's face would change, not because they agreed, but because something had awakened. He tried to remember the last time that it happened. And then it settled over him, heavy and undeniable. No one had taken his voice. There had been no order, no written rule, no line drawn in ink. He had put it down himself. He had chosen safer phrasing, shorter answers, cleaner lessons. He had learned which thoughts to abandon before they reached his mouth. Not because he was forced to, but because it worked. Silence worked. Silence kept meetings brief. Silence kept inboxes empty. Silence let him sleep at night. Silence protected him. It asked nothing, risked nothing, promised stability in exchange for restraint. And silence had no consequences, at least none that were immediate. No laws were changed, no words were banned. There were no announcements, no lists pinned to walls, no red lines drawn across language. Nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is when it happened." People simply learned what not to say. They learned it the way humans have always learned dangerous lessons, not through force, but through observation, through watching who was rewarded, who was left alone, who stopped being invited into rooms without ever being told they were no longer welcome. Once silence proved useful, it spread. It moved quietly, without slogans or uniforms. From classrooms where questions softened into facts, to offices where emails grew careful and meetings shorter, to dinner tables where conversations stopped just before they became uncomfortable, then drifted safely toward weather, work, and plans for the weekend. No one called it fear. They called it maturity, professionalism, being reasonable. Silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like relief. No arguments, no tension, no risk of being misunderstood. The teacher saw it everywhere now, not as a conspiracy, not as control, but as a shared instinct. A collective agreement to stay within invisible lines because life was easier there. Nothing was enforced by power. No one had to. It was reinforced by comfort. Comfort in keeping jobs. Comfort in keeping peace. Comfort in believing that if nothing bad was happening to you, then nothing bad was happening at all. The cost didn't arrive all at once. It arrived later in students who stopped asking why, in adults who forgot how to disagree without fear, in rooms that felt calm, orderly, safe, and strangely hollow. By the time anyone noticed what was missing, they no longer remembered how to speak it back into existence. So the question remains, when silence feels safe, who needs censorship? This was an American Stories episode. And maybe the most powerful system of control isn't built on fear, but on the quiet relief of saying nothing at all.